Judge Aaliyah Monroe watched it all unfold from a distance, not because she didn't want to be in it, but because she understood her role wasn't to lead the protests. Her role was to make sure that when the people demanded answers, there was someone willing to stand inside the system and refuse to let it slip away quietly again. She kept working, meeting with Detective Selena Ortiz, reviewing every new piece of evidence, every new name that surfaced, every connection that needed to be mapped. They weren't building a case anymore. They were building a foundation for change. City officials scrambled to catch up. Press conferences were held. Statements were read. Promises of independent audits and new review boards filled the airwaves. But it wasn't enough. The people weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. They wanted resignations, not reassignments. They wanted real civilian oversight, not another internal department with a new name and the same old faces. They wanted transparency, accountability, justice. And they wanted it now. Jasmine Carter's articles kept the fire burning. Every day, a new piece hit the front page. Quiet settlements that had been paid off in the dark now had names and dollar amounts attached. Officers who had been quietly reassigned after misconduct allegations now had their histories laid bare for the public to see. Jasmine didn't sensationalize the facts. She didn't have to. The truth was loud enough on its own. As the protests grew, so did the momentum for real change. Civil rights groups filed petitions for immediate hearings. Community leaders organized forums where people could come and tell their stories, not to lawyers, not to reporters, but to each other. Stories that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now being shouted into microphones and scribbled onto signs. Stories of stops that turned violent without reason, of complaints that vanished, of trust shattered over and over again. Inside City Hall, the cracks were starting to show. 3 precinct commanders announced early retirements within 2 weeks. A handful of city council members who had quietly pushed back against reform efforts found themselves suddenly facing recall campaigns fueled not by political machines but by ordinary residents who had decided they had waited long enough. The shift was happening, not just in headlines or speeches, but in the way people talked about their city. They didn't say if things would change anymore. They said when. They didn't say they hoped someone would fix it. They said they would. The fear that had once kept people quiet had given way to something stronger, something harder to silence. Judge Monroe knew the danger wasn't over. She knew backlash would come, that some would fight to preserve the old ways by dressing them up in the language of reform. But for the first time in a long time, she believed the momentum was too strong to stop with easy promises. The people weren't just angry. They were awake. And once a city wakes up to the truth, it doesn't fall back asleep easily. Charleston wasn't healed yet. But it was no longer pretending it wasn't broken. And that was the first real step toward something better. Charleston's story didn't stay in Charleston. It didn't matter that it started with one courtroom, one gunshot, one judge who refused to flinch. The moment the truth began to spill out, the ripples moved faster than anyone could contain. National news outlets picked up the story first with cautious headlines, careful not to dive too deep. But it didn't take long before they realized there was nothing cautious about what was happening here. This wasn't another story about a bad cop gone rogue. This was about a city confronting the quiet rot that had lived in its walls for too long, and more importantly, about a woman who stood her ground until the walls started to crumble. Judge Aaliyah Monroe never asked to be the face of anything. She hadn't stood firm in her courtroom that day because she wanted attention. She had done it because that was her job, because justice was supposed to mean something even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. But attention found her anyway. Journalists from New York to Los Angeles started calling, asking for interviews, for statements, for appearances on nightly news panels. She turned them down. Every single one. Her work, she said quietly to those closest to her, was not about selling the story. It was about finishing it. Even without her speaking out, her name traveled fast. Law schools began holding discussions about Charleston's reforms. Civil rights organizations quoted her words in rallies across the country. Panels about police accountability and judicial courage now opened with her example. Cities that had long shrugged off their own internal problems found themselves facing tougher questions from citizens who had watched what happened in Charleston and wondered why it couldn't happen where they lived too. Inside her chambers, Monroe kept her routine steady. She still reviewed cases late into the night, still walked the same hallways she always had, though now the courthouse felt different around her. Some days it was a heavier kind of different, the weight of expectation pressing against her shoulders. Other days, it was lighter, the quiet understanding that she was no longer standing alone. Detective Selena Ortiz continued gathering evidence, helping coordinate the expanding internal investigations. Reporter Jasmine Carter kept publishing story after story, peeling back layers of protection that once would have gone untouched. Together, they weren't just riding a wave. They were steering it. Offers began to come in, not just from reporters but from government bodies. The National Judicial Reform Committee requested her insight for a task force being assembled in Washington. State governors reached out through back channels, asking if she would consult on policy revisions. Universities offered to host lectures. Nonprofits asked her to headline galas and fundraising dinners. Each time she smiled politely, considered the offer, and went right back to her desk. For Monroe, the work wasn't in the speeches. It was in the pages of testimony being prepared for hearings. It was in the red lines drawn through old case files that needed to be reopened. It was in the slow, often invisible process of rebuilding something the right way. Still, even she couldn't ignore that something fundamental had shifted. In Charleston, the Civilian Oversight Board she had fought for moved from proposal to reality faster than anyone predicted. By the time spring rolled around, recruitment had started. Ordinary citizens, teachers, retirees, students, filled out applications to serve, many saying they were inspired by what they had seen in the courtroom and afterward. For the first time, the people who had once been expected to stay silent were now being handed a voice in how their city's justice system would operate. Monroe knew better than to believe the fight was over. She had seen enough resistance already to know that change made enemies, especially when it threatened comfort and control. There would be attempts to stall, to weaken reforms behind closed doors when the cameras moved on. But the people weren't moving on. They had seen too much, learned too much. And they had learned it not through a press release or a campaign speech, but by watching what it looked like when someone refused to back down in the face of danger. She had never wanted to be a symbol. She still didn't. But if her standing tall that day had helped even one person find their voice, if it had pushed even one city to question the stories they told themselves about justice and safety, then it was worth it. Not because it made her special, but because it made the truth harder to ignore. And for the first time in a long time, the truth was finally getting louder than the silence. The verdict came down on a quiet afternoon, but the city felt different that day. The streets around the courthouse were lined with people, not shouting, not holding signs, but simply standing. Watching. Waiting. Logan Barrett stood at the defense table in a plain suit. His shoulders squared but his face hollowed out, carrying none of the arrogance he once wore so easily. He was no longer the man who swaggered through the courtroom, daring anyone to question him. He was just another defendant waiting for the truth to land. The jury did not take long. They had listened carefully, weighed the evidence, but the decision had been clear from the start. Logan Barrett was guilty on all counts. Attempted murder of a federal judge, brandishing a weapon in a secured government building, assault with a deadly weapon, terroristic threats, obstruction of justice. Each word of the verdict felt heavier than the last, not because it surprised anyone, but because it marked the end of a chapter too long in the making. Judge Aaliyah Monroe sat in the gallery that day, not behind the bench. She wore a simple black suit, no robe, no symbols of authority. She was just another citizen watching justice unfold, steady and silent. When the verdict was read, she didn't smile or bow her head. She simply breathed, the kind of breath you take after holding it for far too long. There was no explosion of cheers outside, no confetti, no easy celebrations. Instead, people nodded to each other, a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted. Justice had not just been spoken inside a courtroom. It had been carried into the streets, into the conversations at kitchen tables and community meetings. It had taken root. Across Charleston, the change was visible. The Civilian Oversight Board held its first official meeting just a week later, with community members filling the seats and bringing questions that once would have been brushed aside. Officers now trained under new guidelines that emphasized transparency and accountability. Body cam policies were rewritten. Complaint procedures were overhauled. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but the foundation was no longer built on silence. It was built on the refusal to let old habits hide in the dark. Judge Monroe continued her work, quieter than the headlines made her seem. She reviewed cases. She mentored young attorneys. She spoke in small gatherings about what it meant to stand firm even when standing felt impossible. And when the governor's office called again, asking her to help shape statewide reform efforts, she said yes, not because she wanted recognition, but because she understood how rare it was to have this kind of momentum. It had to be used before it slipped away. Selena Ortiz stayed at her side, leading internal investigations that didn't stop with Barrett. More names surfaced. More resignations followed. Jasmine Carter kept writing, her articles moving beyond Charleston to spark conversations in cities that had once insisted they had no problems worth investigating. What started in one courtroom was now rippling across counties, across states, forcing systems built on whispered cover-ups to face the sunlight for the first time in years. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about rebuilding trust brick by brick, not with promises but with real, enforceable change. It was about teaching a generation of officers, judges, and citizens that justice didn't belong to those who shouted the loudest or wore the most polished badges. It belonged to everyone who had the courage to demand it, and the patience to build it. Charleston wasn't finished. It never would be. Justice wasn't a finish line you crossed once and then forgot. It was a foundation you checked every day for cracks, a structure you kept reinforcing even when the storms passed. But it had been rebuilt from something real this time, something that didn't disappear when the cameras left or when the headlines faded. And on some mornings, as the sun rose over the courthouse steps and the city stirred to life, Judge Aaliyah Monroe would walk past the wall where people had once gathered with anger in their hearts and hope in their hands. The wall now bore murals and names and messages written in every kind of script imaginable, each one a piece of the story they had lived together. She didn't stop and stare. She didn't need to. She carried every name, every voice, every unfinished sentence with her wherever she went. Because this time, justice wasn't just spoken. It was planted, and it was growing. The story of Judge Aaliyah Monroe reminds us that true strength is not measured by power or titles, but by the courage to stand firm when it would be easier to step back. It shows that real change doesn't begin with loud speeches or quick victories. It starts quietly, when someone refuses to look away, even when the cost is high. Justice is not a moment. It's a commitment, one that requires patience, resilience, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. For older generations who have seen promises of change come and go, this story is a reminder that lasting progress is built through steady hands and steady hearts. It takes time, it takes vigilance, and it takes ordinary people choosing to do the hard work of holding systems accountable, not just for themselves but for the generations that follow. No matter how many years have passed, it is never too late to demand better, to protect the truth, and to rebuild what has been broken with integrity. If this story inspired you, we invite you to leave a comment sharing what kind of stories or lessons you would like us to explore next. Your voice matters here. And if you found meaning in today's message, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. That way, you won't miss the powerful stories and lessons we have coming soon. Together, we keep the light shining on what truly matters. You think justice always wins? Think again. What happened inside this courtroom will shake everything you believe about power, courage, and the price of silence. Stay with us, because the ending will change the way you see justice forever. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and let's dive into the truth no one else dares to tell. The heavy clouds hung low over Charleston the morning Logan Barrett walked into the federal courthouse. Everything about the day felt off, like the sun itself wanted no part of what was about to happen. Inside, the tension had been building for weeks, but today it sat heavy in the air, thick enough that even the court staff spoke in hushed tones. In courtroom 2B, people filled every seat they could find, some because they had to be there, others because they needed to see how far things would go. Logan sat at the defendant's table, arms folded, legs stretched out in a way that made it seem like he owned the space. His cheap suit was tight in the shoulders and a little short in the sleeves, but he wore it like body armor, daring anyone to challenge him. His lawyer leaned in close before the judge entered, trying to keep Logan's mouth in check, but it was already clear that nothing short of a miracle would keep him from exploding. Across the room, Judge Aaliyah Monroe prepared to take the bench. She was steady, deliberate, not just because of the pressure, but because she knew men like Logan were always watching, always waiting for her to slip. She had seen resentment like his before, The kind that didn't announce itself loudly but simmered, burning quietly until it found a way to break loose. As she entered the courtroom, the murmurs faded. Every eye in the room shifted between the woman in the black robe and the man already gripping the edge of his table too tightly. Logan's hatred wasn't about the charges stacked against him, not really. It was about who had the authority to judge him. In his mind, Aaliyah Monroe represented everything he thought he was better than. Every nod she gave, every ruling she handed down, even her presence in the courtroom felt like an insult to him. He had spent years building an image of himself as the protector, the strong one, the man who kept the city safe from the people he thought didn't deserve it. Now here he was, sitting under the judgment of someone he had been taught to dismiss long before he ever met her. The evidence against Logan was mounting quickly, each testimony and every forensic report pulling apart the story he tried so hard to sell. Discrepancies in his reports, missing body cam footage, witnesses who refused to be silent any longer, all of it weaving a narrative that he could not control. With every new piece of evidence, his posture stiffened, his jaw clenched tighter, and the glare he sent across the room grew darker. He wasn't thinking about defense strategies or legal options. He was thinking about how unfair it all felt. In his mind, he had bled for this city, he had worn the badge, and that alone should have been enough to shield him from judgment. From the very beginning, Logan saw the trial not as a reckoning for his actions but as an attack on his identity. He didn't hear the testimonies for what they were. He heard them as personal insults. Every correction to his reports, every contradiction pointed out, felt like a challenge to his authority. It was a slow boil, day after day, witness after witness, tightening around him like a noose he refused to admit was real. Even as his lawyer begged him to stay silent, to let the system play out, Logan's pride wouldn't allow it. He believed that silence was weakness, that anger was strength. What he didn't realize was that everyone in that courtroom could see the difference. As the proceedings dragged on, his bitterness grew too big to hide, and it seeped out in muttered curses, in glares, in the way his hand twitched at the edge of the table whenever a ruling didn't go his way. He wasn't fighting the charges anymore. He was fighting the fact that someone like Aaliyah Monroe dared to sit higher than him. And deep down, even he knew he was losing. The day Logan Barrett finally snapped, it started like any other session of the trial. People filed into the courtroom with coffee cups clutched tight and notebooks half opened, ready to scribble down whatever new twist might unfold. No one expected the air to feel different, heavier somehow, but it did. The regular tension of a high-profile case was always there, but on this morning, something colder had crept into the room. Judge Aaliyah Monroe noticed it the second she stepped through the side door and took her seat. She had learned long ago how to read the room, to sense when the energy shifted. And today, that shift clung to everything. Logan was already seated at the defendant's table, his hands resting flat, almost too flat, like he was holding something in. His lawyer looked more tired than usual, the kind of tired that comes from arguing all night with someone who refuses to listen. The early testimonies rolled out as scheduled, clean and methodical, but Logan was not listening. His eyes flicked from the prosecutor to the judge to the gallery and back again. His breathing was a little too fast, the set of his shoulders a little too tight. Most people in the room missed it, but not the court officers, and certainly not Judge Monroe. They knew the signs. As another witness was sworn in, the forensic analyst from the earlier session, Logan's fingers started tapping a steady beat against the table. A nervous tick maybe, or maybe the rhythm of a man working himself up to something he knew he couldn't undo. When the analyst started speaking about tampered evidence and missing dashcam footage, Logan's face twisted into a sneer. He muttered under his breath loud enough for the nearest rows to hear, drawing glances from the bailiffs posted near the walls. Judge Monroe gave a soft warning, her voice calm but firm. That should have been enough. On any other day, maybe it would have been. But today, the warning did not land. Logan pushed back from the table just slightly, enough that the legs of his chair scraped loudly against the polished wood floor. The sound sliced through the quiet like a knife, and heads snapped toward him. His lawyer leaned in quickly, whispering with an urgency that made his words almost visible in the air between them, but Logan brushed him off. He rose to his feet in a slow, deliberate motion, not rushing, not panicking, but with a kind of grim finality that made every muscle in the room lock tight. The bailiffs took half a step forward, unsure if they should intervene yet, but Judge Monroe subtly raised her hand, stopping them with nothing more than a glance. Her eyes never left Logan. She understood exactly what was happening even before his hand dipped into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. There was no shouting, no wild movement. Just that soft, awful sound of fabric rustling and the click of metal against leather as he pulled the weapon free. For a moment, time itself seemed to hesitate. People gasped, a sharp intake of collective breath, but no one screamed. No one ran. It was like the courtroom had been frozen, every heart hammering so hard it felt like the walls would hear. Logan raised the gun, a small matte black pistol, leveling it straight at the bench. His voice came low, not yelling, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Nobody move. Judge Monroe did not move. She did not flinch or duck or fumble for a panic button. She kept her hands visible on the bench, her posture strong and unshaken. She met Logan's eyes and held them, not with anger, but with a calm certainty that made the gun in his hand seem smaller somehow, less powerful. The bailiffs along the walls were ready, every muscle coiled, waiting for the right moment to move, but they held back because they knew if they made the wrong move too soon, the entire room could erupt. Logan took a slow step forward, then another. His hand trembled slightly at the wrist, not from fear of what he might do, but from knowing he had already passed the point of no return. He shouted again, demanding attention, demanding respect, but the only answer he got was the steady, unbroken gaze of Judge Monroe. She spoke to him, not loud, not pleading, but clear enough that her words wrapped around the entire room. And whatever she said, it wasn't fear she gave him. It was the mirror he had spent his whole life avoiding. The doors behind the gallery cracked open without a sound, and out of the corner of his eye, Logan might have seen the tactical gear moving in. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Either way, it was too late. The SWAT team led by Detective Selena Ortiz flooded the room in one coordinated rush, their voices clipped and sharp, their movements perfect. In seconds, Logan was tackled to the floor, the gun knocked from his hand, sliding across the polished wood like a final broken promise. Cuffs clicked tight around his wrists. The room, still holding its breath, finally exhaled. Judge Monroe stood steady behind the bench, never once having left her place. It was not the bullet or the weapon that had defined the moment. It was the strength to stay standing when the world cracked open around her. When the gun was raised and the room locked itself in fear, it would have been easy for Judge Aaliyah Monroe to react like anyone else. She could have ducked behind the bench, scrambled for the emergency button tucked beneath the wood, or called for the bailiffs to swarm the defendant. But that was not who she was. Every fiber of her being, every hard-earned lesson carved from years of standing firm in rooms that had been stacked against her, told her that the most dangerous thing she could do right now was show fear. And so she didn't. She stayed right where she was, hands on the bench, chin lifted, eyes steady on Logan Barrett as if the gun he waved at her was no more threatening than a scowl. Logan's rage was loud, pouring out of him in choppy bursts of half-formed accusations and bitter memories. He moved like a man trying to outrun the truth, pacing in short, angry strides, throwing words at her like stones. But none of it landed. Monroe's stillness was its own answer, a calm refusal to be pulled into his spiral. She listened without flinching, her silence louder than any defense he could mount. It was not silence out of fear. It was deliberate. She knew what Logan needed, deep down, more than any courtroom acknowledgement or legal loophole. He needed her to break. He needed her to panic, to react, to somehow prove that he still had power here. When she didn't, the balance of control began to tilt, almost imperceptibly at first, but it tilted all the same. As he waved the gun, his threats grew louder, but the edges of them frayed. The words got messier, the points less sharp. Monroe saw it happening. She saw the moment when the anger started to lose its edge and reveal what was underneath. Fear. Not fear of being shot, not fear of dying or prison. It was the fear of being seen without the armor he had spent a lifetime wearing. In her courtroom, with every word, every inch he moved toward her, Logan was stripping himself bare. And Monroe made sure he felt it. She spoke to him not with anger but with clarity. She told him the truth he had never let himself hear. That the badge hadn't made him powerful, it had only hidden his weakness. That the violence he once called strength had only exposed his desperation. She didn't shout it, she didn't accuse him. She simply held a mirror to his face and let him see it for himself. The more she spoke, the more the cracks showed. His hands shook a little more. His voice wavered even when it rose. The bravado that had carried him into this final reckless act began to crumble under the weight of reality. He was not the hero he thought he was. He was a man standing alone, holding a gun, not because he had been wronged, but because he could not stand to be judged by someone he never believed was his equal. Monroe knew she was gambling. Every second she stayed exposed, every breath she took without ducking behind protection, raised the stakes. But she also knew that if she gave up even an inch of ground, it would validate everything Logan believed about fear and control. So she stood her ground, her words steady, not trying to overpower him but inviting him, daring him, to realize the truth. The tactical team moved quietly into position, invisible to Logan in his tunnel vision rage, but Monroe did not rely on them. Her trust was not in guns or shields. Her trust was in the fact that truth, real truth, had a way of dismantling even the strongest lies from the inside out. She watched his breathing get heavier, not with strength but with confusion. He had expected fear, maybe even tears, but he got calm defiance instead. He had come ready for a battle of force, not a battle of will. And now that he was losing it, he didn't know where to put all the anger he had carried in. When Logan finally faltered, Monroe saw it. She saw the hesitation, the slack in his posture, the way his eyes darted around the room, searching for something solid to hold on to and finding nothing. That was the beginning of the end. Not when the SWAT team stormed in. Not when the cuffs snapped closed around his wrists. The true collapse happened when he realized that no matter how loud he shouted, no matter how high he waved the gun, he could not make her fear him. And that, more than anything, was his undoing. The moment Logan Barrett's grip tightened around the gun and his voice cracked with the weight of everything he had lost, the quiet, invisible clock running inside that courtroom finally hit zero. It was not a loud moment, not at first. No shouting, no gunfire, no sudden lunge. It was the kind of shift you could feel in the pit of your stomach before your mind even caught up. In the back hallways of the courthouse, the SWAT team led by Detective Selena Ortiz moved with a kind of precision that only came from training for moments like this and praying they would never happen. No one shouted orders. No one hesitated. They breached the side entrances and gallery doors in a perfectly timed sweep, bursting into the courtroom with a storm of movement and clipped commands that shattered the heavy stillness like glass. Logan barely had time to register what was happening. 1 second, he was pacing in front of the bench, brandishing the gun like it was the only thing keeping him afloat. The next, he was surrounded. Officers in black tactical gear, rifles raised, shields up, each one shouting layered commands that cut through the tension with brutal clarity. Drop the weapon. Get down. Hands where we can see them. Logan spun in place, wide-eyed, the gun jerking slightly as he tried to figure out where to point it, who to blame. But it didn't matter. Every exit was closed. Every path he could have run down was blocked. Judge Monroe stayed steady behind the bench, her gaze locked on him, her hands still calmly resting where he could see them. She didn't need to say anything anymore. Her silence now carried a different kind of power, one Logan could no longer fight. He looked around, one last desperate sweep of the room, as if searching for a way to turn the tide back in his favor. But the people he might have once intimidated were no longer frozen by fear. They were crouched behind benches, eyes steady, waiting for it to be over. He was not the force he thought he was. He was just a man, desperate and cornered, clinging to a lie that had stopped protecting him the moment he raised the gun. For a split second, Logan hesitated. His gun wavered, lowering just a few inches. The officers tensed, ready to act. A single wrong move, and everything would spiral. Judge Monroe caught it too. She could see it in his posture, the tiny collapse in his shoulders, the crack in his resolve. She knew there was a chance, slim but real, that he might surrender. But then, something twisted inside him. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the simple inability to imagine a world where he did not have the final word. Whatever it was, it made him raise the gun again, this time leveling it at the bench with one last burst of anger. The gunshot cracked through the room like a lightning strike. For a heartbeat, it felt like the world held its breath. Logan fired once, a wild, desperate shot that missed Judge Monroe by inches, splintering the mahogany behind her in a burst of smoke and broken wood. She did not flinch. She did not move. Before the sound of the shot had even finished echoing, the SWAT team closed in. 2 officers slammed into Logan from the side, knocking the gun from his hand with a brutal efficiency that left no room for mistakes. It clattered across the floor, spinning out of reach. Logan hit the ground hard, face first against the polished wood, the weight of 3 officers pressing him down as metal cuffs snapped tight around his wrists. He didn't resist. There was no more fight left in him. The anger that had burned so hot just moments before was gone, leaving behind only the broken shell of a man who had spent too long mistaking fear for power. Detective Ortiz moved through the chaos with steady, measured steps. She called out the suspect secured, her voice professional but not cold. Around her, the court officers began to help the stunned spectators to their feet, checking for injuries, calming the lingering panic with quiet efficiency. Judge Monroe remained behind the bench for a long moment, surveying the room with calm, steady eyes. She looked down at the bullet hole a few inches to her right, touched the edge of it lightly with her fingertips, and then straightened again. "I am fine," she said, not as a reassurance, but as a fact. In the gallery, people began to breathe again, some weeping quietly, others just sitting in stunned silence. Logan was lifted to his knees, cuffed and defeated, his head bowed low, not out of respect, but out of exhaustion. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't say a word. Selena Ortiz collected the weapon, locking it into an evidence bag with careful hands. Then she turned to Judge Monroe and offered a nod, a silent acknowledgement of what had just been avoided and what had just begun. Because even though the immediate danger had passed, everyone in that room knew that the real fight, the one for justice and accountability, was only getting started. In the days that followed Logan Barrett's arrest, the courthouse in Charleston didn't return to normal. The walls still stood, the clock still ticked, the gavels still fell, but something underneath all of it had shifted. It was in the way people spoke in the hallways, a little more carefully now, a little more aware. It was in the way the court clerks double-checked documents, and the way officers patrolling the halls glanced toward every closed door just a little longer. No one said it out loud yet, but everyone knew. The trial hadn't just exposed a dangerous man. It had ripped the seams wide open on something much bigger, something that had been hidden in plain sight for years. Judge Aaliyah Monroe didn't waste time. While the media scrambled for headlines and the city leaders crafted statements, she sat in her office, piecing through every complaint, every report, and every name that had crossed Barrett's path during his time in uniform. It didn't take long to see the patterns forming. He wasn't an isolated case. He was the product of a system that had protected him at every turn. Documents showed missing body cam footage, suspiciously closed internal affairs investigations, supervisors who had reassigned him after use of force incidents instead of disciplining him. Detective Selena Ortiz worked alongside her, pulling files from every department she could access, quietly reaching out to old contacts who had stories to tell but had never been given the chance to tell them. Together, they started mapping it out. Captain Daniel Mercer's name surfaced first, tied to sign-offs on 3 separate investigations where evidence had mysteriously disappeared. Then came the names of internal affairs officers who had been tasked with reviewing Barrett's conduct but had instead filed incomplete reports and closed cases without thorough interviews. The list grew with every passing hour. It wasn't just officers either. It was supervisors who ignored red flags to protect department statistics. It was assistant district attorneys who declined to press charges in cases with clear evidence, citing lack of probable cause while quietly noting the potential political fallout in private emails. It was union representatives who fought harder to shield bad cops than they ever did to defend good ones. Piece by piece, Monroe and Ortiz assembled a picture that was uglier than either of them had hoped and more familiar than they wanted to admit. Reporter Jasmine Carter picked up the thread almost immediately. She had been covering courthouse cases for years but had never seen a story like this. With Monroe's quiet encouragement, she dug into old settlement agreements the city had paid out to victims of police misconduct. Most had never made it into the papers. Quiet money with confidentiality clauses had kept the truth buried. But now the truth was clawing its way to the surface, and Jasmine was determined to drag it into the light. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became that Logan Barrett wasn't a rogue element. He was exactly the kind of officer the system had been designed to protect. Complaints about him were redirected, evidence lost or mishandled, internal investigations closed before they ever had a chance to reveal anything damaging. And when someone tried to sound the alarm, they were either silenced or quietly moved out of the way. Judge Monroe understood the danger of what they were unearthing. It wasn't just about one bad cop anymore. It was about the machinery that allowed him to thrive, the quiet agreements and shoulder shrugs that said it was easier to bury the truth than to fix the problem. She moved carefully, documenting every thread, ensuring every piece of evidence would stand up to scrutiny. She wasn't building a headline. She was building a case so solid that no one could dismiss it when the time came. Within a week, the investigation expanded beyond Barrett. The names of senior officials started appearing in whispered conversations and cautious emails. The city's leadership tried to stay ahead of the story, issuing vague promises about independent reviews and procedural changes. But it was too late for spin. Too many people had seen too much. The story was no longer just about what Barrett had done. It was about what others had allowed, about the cost of silence, and about a system that would rather protect its image than protect its people. Monroe, Ortiz, and Carter weren't just exposing corruption. They were forcing a city to confront the parts of itself it had spent far too long pretending not to see. And they were only getting started. The news about Logan Barrett and the corruption behind him spread through Charleston like a fire catching dry grass. It wasn't the kind of outrage that came and went in a wave of hashtags and headlines. This was deeper. It settled into people's bones. It stayed in their voices when they spoke to their neighbors, their co-workers, their children. It wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about realizing how many times they had been told everything was fine when it wasn't. How many times their concerns had been swept aside by men in polished offices who smiled in public and signed silence into policy behind closed doors. At first, the protests were small, pockets of people gathering on courthouse steps and city hall sidewalks with homemade signs and tired but determined faces. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was steady, like a drumbeat that refused to be ignored. Teachers marched alongside nurses. Small business owners stood shoulder to shoulder with students still wearing backpacks. Mothers pushed strollers while holding handwritten lists of names, not slogans, but names of the people the system had failed. It wasn't just outrage fueling them. It was a stubborn kind of hope, the kind that said maybe if they stood long enough, loud enough, someone would finally listen.